So today we're going to look at Noise by Daniel Kahneman and a couple other authors. The flagship author is Kahneman. That's why I got the book. That's the one I'm going to mention. So, Noise, in Kahneman's previous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he really explores these idea of biases. And what a bias is a sort of error in judgment where you are skewed in a particular way very consistently. So, for example, when people are estimating how much time it's going to take in a construction project and how much it's going to cost, they almost always underestimate how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. So, if you know this sort of bias, you should just, roughly speaking, double the amount of time. From personal experience, working on stuff with friends like going to Home Depot, you always need 2 trips to Home Depot. It's never one, and it always takes twice as long as you think it's going to take. So, that's an example of a bias. What noise is about introducing this secondary way you can fail in judgment. And whereas bias is a sort of an error that occurs in one direction, noise is about having just a larger scatter in terms of your outcomes as a result of things that are not related to the judgment itself. So a way to think about it, and this is the way that they illustrate in the book, if you are firing at a target, if you're firing arrows at a target, bias would be if all the shots are to the left, that's bias. Noise would be if all the shots are scattered, that's noise. And an interesting thing to note is that if you average results, you will be able to detect bias because the average will be skewed one way. But if you average results, you will not be able to detect noise because the averages can cancel out. So you need other things, other methods for detecting noise. They do something with squaring, and they have an equation for noise that involves squaring stuff. So the farther off you are, the bigger error it's going to be, because when you square something, it's exponential instead of linear. Okay, so here an example of something that's noisy would be in the afternoon or later in the day, physicians will be more likely to do stuff that saves them time. So, for example, they will wash their hands less later in the day. They will also advocate for certain procedures that take less time later in the day. And this one's particularly alarming. They are less likely to diagnose someone with cancer later in the day because that involves a large, follow-up sort of explanation. And so, it's noisy because this largely arbitrary factor, how late it is in the day, is informing decisions in a way that it ought not to be, and so noise is created. I think the best example of the noise in the book, and I'll just talk about it for a little bit, is judges and the judicial system. So, whichever judge you get is largely random, right? And I think in an ideal situation, when judges are giving sentences for crimes, they'd all arrive at kind of roughly the same sort of sentencing. But the truth is a lot of judges are way more harsh than others, and a lot of judges are way more lenient than others. And so you get cases where there's instances of, the book cites this petty theft, and it gives 2 thefts amounts, and one, and the theft amounts are they're within 5% of each other, what was stolen. In one case, the person gets 3 months, and in another case, the person gets 15 years. And this is just seems like a horrible injustice, right? Because if you were just assigned the other judge, your life would have taken a way different turn. But since you were assigned the harsh judge or the lenient judge, your life is now way different. But it's important to note the averages might cancel out. Maybe 7.5 years is the appropriate sentence on average for such transgressions, right? But if one person's serving 15 years and another person's serving 3 months, right, then the outcome is someone's being overpunished and someone's being underpunished, and even though it averages out, there's still a gross miscarriage of judgment. Another example is that judges will sentence people longer right before lunch than right after lunch. Though ostensibly they are grumpy, and so maybe maybe you give them a Snickers. And so there's a few ways to reduce noise, and the book gives several ways of doing it. One is you can just let's talk about the judges specifically. One, you can just reduce the sentencing range, right? You could say that instead of 3 months to 15 years for this offense, you can say it's 5 months, or sorry, not 5 months, 5 years to 10 years, right? And when you narrow the band, you decrease the type of mistake that can be made. Generally speaking, experts really hate this. They want to have more options. Right? The judges want to have as much leeway as they want, but when the pool of judges just has a large diversity in terms of who's harsh and who's lenient, then that makes it so that which judge you get assigned is like a really big deal, and it should just be less of a deal if you want to make the judicial system more fair. Also, if you decrease the band, you'll decrease the noise for the same judge type of noise, where one judge is giving longer sentences right before lunch than after. That's one way to address it. Another way to address it is by having multiple experts make an evaluation of the thing. So, for example, if you took 3 judges and you averaged their score in terms of how long they think the sentence should be, that would also reduce noise. I think with judging specifically, it's also important to note that there's also bias in judging. And bias is, again, when a specific error tends to get made. So an example of bias in judging is when black people are convicted of the same crime. This is in the United States. When black people are convicted of the exact same crime, they on average important to mention, will serve longer sentence than white people. And the noise tends to disproportionately, the noise in terms of people over serving sentences or serving the higher range of sentences. It's hard to say over because what amount of time is appropriate is not like an objective fact. They're just serving the higher band. Those people tend to be people of color. Okay, sorry for the car alarm if you can hear it. And so if you were to do stuff to decrease noise, that would help solve like racial injustice, because even though it helps everyone out, because you can definitely still be a white person and just roll, like in terms of the random roll of which judge you get, roll a really harsh judge, or a really lenient judge. Like both errors are bad, right? If we think that certain people or certain crimes should get certain lengths, then it's important that you don't have like judges that are too lenient either. But it's clear that reducing the noise helps everyone in terms of having a more fair outcome. But it disproportionately helps, reducing the errors disproportionately helps people who are most disaffected by those errors, which is people of color. So I thought that was worth mentioning because I think it kind of ties up the analysis a bit in terms of thinking about judges specifically, which I think it's the best example because it really shows you how much someone's life could get affected by something that is basically just random, right? Because if you roll the harsh judge versus rolling the lenient judge, that's like a super big deal, and it has nothing to do with your crime, right? It's just very arbitrary. It has nothing to do with the process of judging your individual case. It's just outside of that. And so another example is like when giving quotes for insurance rates, different people who are experts will have a huge range, and some people will quote low generally, and some people will quote high generally, and a lot of people will quote differently than they had in the past, even given the same case, which is obviously a problem of noise as well. Anytime someone's quoting too high for insurance, They are, they're losing customers, so they're losing money for the insurance. And anytime someone's quoting too low, they're losing the insurance company money because they're probably going to have to pay out more than they're taking in on average. And so these types of errors occur across a ton of different areas like medicine, business, law. But I think the judging one is perhaps the most striking. So let's get into the ratings a little bit. So utility, I gave it a 6.5 because I think that by pointing out the way that this type of error, this noise error can occur, I think it helps you to perhaps take measures to make your own judgment better. And I think that it does this in a very broad and generalistic way that is applicable to a lot of areas. And, like maybe you just never make a certain type of decision on an empty stomach would be an example of something you could do that's not explicitly stated in the book, but informed by some of the ideas in the book, right? Because if you do it on an empty stomach, you're more likely to make a certain type of decision. There's like, if you're specifically going grocery shopping, that's probably something you extra shouldn't do on an empty stomach, right? Okay, so for novelty, I give it a 7. I think a lot of people are aware of bias, but they're less aware of noise as a factor of impeding judgments or making bad judgments. But noise is very much a factor, just as bias is. It's just harder to see because in the averages, noise disappears entirely. And so, just like with the judge sentence, if on average they're supposed to be serving 7.5 years, if you have 15 years and 3 years, 3 months or whatever, you're still getting the right average, but man, oh man, is it better to just have 7.5 years, right? When the crime is effectively the same. And it's just, the data of averages won't always show you what's going on when it's unfair or just poor judgment. In the case of like insurance, that's not like quite unfair. It's just costing the insurance company money. For entertainment, I gave it a 6. I think it's written in a fairly upbeat and engaging way, and is like also pretty interesting. And the interesting gives it a score on the on the entertainment. Style, I gave it a 6. I think it's fairly well written. The ideas are presented in a way that's pretty accessible. I do think like some parts just felt like mildly disjointed from other parts, and I think this is just a consequence of there being 3 authors. I don't know. It's hard to say. Like maybe style should have been higher. It's just comes off as like strange a little bit. The style changes, and so perhaps each of the styles individually could have been rated higher, but like together the change in the style like just threw me off a little, and I gave it a 6. Readability, I gave it a 7. The ideas are presented in really in a way that makes them very easy to absorb, but at the same time there's some complexity, and there's like they reference studies, but I think like the metaphors that they suggest, for example, if you're shooting arrows at a target, if all the arrows are to the left, it's bias. If the arrows are scattered, it's noise. And they add like this extra thing, whereas if you are looking at the back of the target and there's bias, you don't know where the bullseye is. So for all you know, they're all hitting target. So it's harder to, in some ways, it's different to evaluate that sort of judgment. Because often you don't know if there's noise or bias in your judgments because you don't know like what the truth is. And specifically when you're making predictions about the future, you don't know what the truth is yet in the judgment, right? So it's impossible to know. You have to look at the back of the target. And so if you have 10 people who are predicting the future and they're all roughly predicting the same future and they turn out to be wrong because you're looking at the back of the target, you don't know until they're wrong, then that's bias. But if all 10 people are making way different predictions, then that's noise. Okay. And if you look at the back of the target when it's just scattered, you have no idea where like the middle of the target is, but if it's all scattered, then you know there's something wrong with the judging, right? If everyone predicts the same outcome and it's wrong by a lot, the approach you take is different than if everyone's predicting way different outcomes in terms of reducing the errors in judgment. Okay, so for interesting, I gave it an 8. I feel that this is like the big strength of the book. They're kind of pointing out something that's novel and interesting and affects a lot of us in a way that we perhaps don't appreciate, especially because data is often presented in averages, and the averages just erase noise. But I think a lot of times in the public sphere, you get instances that create a lot of outrage where someone serves a way longer sentence than you feel they ought to, and someone serves a way shorter sentence than you feel they ought to. And I think that in the case of being judged criminal type stuff, and I think a lot of cases, they just view this one case as being representative of what goes on at large. But if you think about it, it's probably just an exceptional case where they just got way longer sentence because they got a way harsher judge, or way shorter sentence because they got a way more lenient judge. And you see a lot of this where they'll compare two cases to another that aren't the same judge, and so a lot of those cases make sense. Like, I'm not saying so like Brock Turner, like he got like 3 months for raping this woman, and I've often seen like juxtapositions where they take Brock Turner, they're like, he got 3 months, and then they take a black person and they're like, he got 25 to life or whatever it is. And it's the juxtaposition is just to be clear, I don't have, so the random person's case, that's a person of color, that gets often put alongside Brock Turner. I don't have an opinion on that case. And Brock Turner, I think he probably should have had a longer sentence than 3 months. But what this type of thing is generally used to argue is something that is true, which is that black people tend to serve longer sentences, but they don't tend to serve that much longer sentences. Like, and by that much longer, I mean, what is it, 100-fold like increase? Like, that's not representative, but it's like held up as like, oh, this is how it looks, when in reality it's just two different judges. It's different, it's noise. Like, Brock Turner might have had a super lenient judge, and then the person who got 25 years might have had a super strict judge, and that's like just how it shakes out with sentencing as a nature of the system. But you'll also have like white people serving 25 plus years too, and then some just getting very low sentences as well. And it's that the dice is being rolled on the judges, in addition to racial bias, which is also there, is, that is often concealed in the way it's represented in media, like social media. That the judge is the random element of which judge you are assigned dramatically affects sentencing. That kind of gets swept under the rug, and we could emphasize as the racial difference, which is there, but it's not. The effect isn't as large as it's often portrayed as. Anyways, I feel like I've run off on a bit of a tangent, but it is interesting, especially like the stuff where like doctors are like, they wash their hands less like later in the day, and like they're more likely to not give a cancer judgment, and they're not doing this consciously. Like, this isn't something that's pernicious. It's just kind of how it shakes out. And so this is one of the reasons why doctors have super strict procedures regarding hand washing, because what happened before is they knew that the hand washing was important, but they just didn't wash their hands, and because they're just like, and then when there's a procedure that's like, you must wash your hands in this exact manner, like using a timer or whatever, and then they have to do it, you just decrease infection rates, because you have to abide. And that's sometimes that's the way to do it. By having really strict procedural rules, you can reduce noise. Of course, those rules will have drawbacks, but one of the great things is if everyone does the exact same thing, you'll get the exact same type of outcome, roughly speaking, as opposed to doctors that use their judgment as to whether or not they need to wash their hands. Okay, so an overall rating of 6.75, quite high, although in general, I prefer Daniel Kahneman's first book, Thinking Fast and Slow, to this one. I think that the biases are a little bit more interesting and that sort of thing. I think I give that book over a 7. I'd recommend both books. They're pretty interesting. I think there's quite a bit of utility in both. I think that the noise is perhaps a bit more novel than bias, because noise doesn't get covered a lot. And it's... if you are trying to just become better at judging things, as like, this is getting into recommendations. If you're trying to just sharpen your judgment at anything, whether it's like picking stocks or just anything, I think that being aware of noise is really valuable, because it can allow you to adopt strategies to decrease noise in your own judgment, through a variety of like methods that are offered in the book. And the book does offer quite a bit of practical solutions, although they are a bit... a lot of them apply not just to developing your own judgment, but improving judgment within an organization, I think is kind of the angle that a lot of them take. So that's mainly the basis I would recommend this book on, is if you are looking to improve your judgment, or just like are interested in like a psychology book that covers some interesting things. If you're interested in criminal justice reform, the first 2 to 3 chapters probably pretty interesting, because they cover a lot of this stuff I was talking about with the judges, which I think is I just think the judges should have like way less leeway in terms of their sentencing. I don't necessarily think people should be serving shorter sentences or longer sentences. I just think that the judges should have... if the judges have a ton of variance between the judges in terms of how they would sentence an individual case, then they just should have way less power in that regard. They should have, if their opinions vary so widely. If like their opinions were all relatively close to each other, which they're not, then I would be all for, judges having bigger leeway, because some instances of the same crime are worse than others. Like, an assault where you slap someone is not as bad as an assault where you punch someone, right? And so, in that regard, I would prefer to have more judgment, but not for... the variance is too large between judges. What's interesting, though, is if you gave the judges like 20 cases and asked them to rank them most severe to least severe in terms of like how they would sentence, their rankings tended to be really close. So the judges had common ground in terms of like which case they thought was the worst and which case they thought was not so bad. But where they differed is kind of like the base rates for like where they thought the sentencing should be and that sort of stuff, which explains the variance more so than ranking. They all ranked very closely, and so in some ways their evaluation is similar, but their evaluation of sentencing is just way different. Anyways, as far as discussion goes, does anyone think they might have examples of noise, or how randomness, seemingly random factors, are informing decision making in a way that's not appropriate? The one I find the most amusing, although it's really in some ways not that funny, is judges will give longer sentences right before lunch because they're hungry. And okay, it's not funny because it ruins people's lives, but it just makes me think of Snickers commercials. It's like, oh, you're ruining some kid's life there, Jerry. Eat a Snickers. And I find that a little bit funny. Although, not the life-ruining part. If you like this, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. Juice my Aligo. and have a good day.